Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing on the shores of a lake that no longer exists, in a valley where time itself seems to hold its breath. The water stretches endlessly before you, mirror still, reflecting clouds that drift like ancient spirits across an endless sky. In the distance, rising from the lake itself like a vision from dreams, stands a city of white stone and floating gardens. This is Tenochtitlan. This is the heart of an empire that would make the gods themselves weep with wonder. Tonight, we journey back to a world where jaguars prowled through pyramids, where chocolate was more precious than gold, and where the very stars were believed to be the tears of deities. We walk in the footsteps of warriors who painted their faces with the colors of sunrise, of priests who read the future in the flight of eagles, and of emperors who believed themselves chosen by the sun itself. But before we begin this journey into the mists of time, I invite you to join our community of dreamers and history lovers. Subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel, and in the comments below, whisper to us what other forgotten worlds you'd love to explore together in the gentle hours before sleep. Now let the world around you fade. Dim the lights. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow, like the rhythm of ancient drums. Tonight, you are not just a listener. You are a witness to one of humanity's most extraordinary civilizations. You will walk through markets where the air shimmers with incense and flowers, stand in the shadows of temples that touch the clouds, and feel the pulse of an empire that believed the very universe depended on their sacred rituals. Are you ready? Then let us begin. In the beginning, there was only wandering. Picture, if you will, a people moving like shadows across a landscape painted in shades of amber and dust. They called themselves the Mexica, and they had been walking for generations, following a prophecy that seemed as elusive as morning mist. The year was somewhere in the mists of the 13th century, and the high plateau of Mexico stretched endlessly before them like a sea of grass and stone. Their feet knew the texture of volcanic soil, the sharp bite of mountain air, the way dawn light fell differently on each new valley they entered. They were not yet the Aztecs of legend. They were simply travelers, carrying their god Huitzilopochtli in a sacred bundle, listening for his voice in the whisper of wind through agave leaves. Their clothes were simple then, rough-woven maguey fiber that scratched against skin weathered by countless suns. Their children learned to walk on paths that changed with each season, to find water in the song of hidden streams, to read the language of clouds gathering over distant mountains. They were a people between worlds, between the settled life they had left behind and the destiny that called to them from somewhere beyond the horizon. The other peoples of the valley watched them with suspicious eyes. These Mexica were latecomers, barbarians from the north, who spoke with strange accents and carried weapons that seemed crude compared to the refined obsidian blades of the established city-states. In the markets of Texcoco and Culhuacan, merchants would whisper about these wanderers who appeared at dawn like ghosts, traded for a few precious hours, then disappeared again into the wilderness. But the Mexica carried something more powerful than weapons. They carried a vision. Their priest spoke of a sign that would mark the end of their wandering. An eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent, on an island in the middle of a lake. It was an image that lived in their dreams, painted on their prayers, whispered in the songs their mothers sang to children who had never known a permanent home. The lake of Texcoco stretched before them like a mirror reflecting the sky, its surface broken by small islands and the gentle wakes of fishing canoes. The water was brackish, touched with salt, and it supported an ecosystem as complex as any jungle. Herons stood motionless in the shallows, their reflections perfect doubles in the still water. Fish moved in silver schools just below the surface, and somewhere in the reeds, the calls of hidden birds created a symphony that seemed to welcome the dawn. It was here, on these shores, that the Mexica finally stopped their wandering. The exact moment is lost to time, but imagine the first scout who saw it. The eagle, majestic and terrible, perched on a nopal cactus that grew from what seemed like solid rock. In its talons, a serpent writhed. The eternal struggle between earth and sky played out in a single sacred image. The scout's heart must have stopped, his breath caught in his throat, as generations of prophecy crystallized into reality before his eyes. The word spread through the traveling band like wildfire. Families dropped their bundles and ran to see. Children pressed between the legs of adults, straining to catch a glimpse of the divine sign. The priests fell to their knees, their voices rising in prayers that seemed to make the very air shimmer with possibility. This was it. This was the place where their God had promised they would build a city that would rival the heavens themselves. But the reality was harsh. The island, for that's what it was, a small patch of land barely large enough for a modest village, rose from the lake like a stubborn dream. The soil was poor, little more than mud and reeds. There was no fresh water, no timber for construction, no stone for building. The neighboring city-states watched from their comfortable cities on the mainland, probably amusing themselves with the thought of these barbarians trying to build a civilization on what amounted to a glorified swamp. The Mexica saw something different. They saw possibility in the gentle lapping of waves, opportunity in the rich muck that lay beneath the water's surface. They understood, perhaps better than any people before or since, that the greatest civilizations are not built on the easiest ground. They are built by those who refuse to surrender to impossibility. The first structures were simple: reed huts that swayed with the wind, raised platforms that kept families dry during the seasonal floods. But even these humble beginnings were touched with the sacred. Every pole driven into the soft earth was blessed. Every bundle of reeds was offered to the gods before being woven into walls. This was not just construction, it was creation, the birth of a world that would one day make the earth itself tremble with its power. As the sun set on their first day in what would become Tenochtitlan, the Mexica gathered in the growing darkness. Their fires flickered like stars fallen to earth, and in their flames they saw the future. Children who had been born on the wandering path would grow old in houses that never moved. Their grandchildren would know the luxury of stone walls and permanent gardens, and their great-grandchildren would be warriors and priests in an empire that stretched from sea to sea. The lake lapped gently against the muddy shores of their new home, and in that sound, the Mexica heard the heartbeat of their unborn city. They had found their place in the world. Now they would make the world acknowledge their place in it. The morning light fell differently on the lake of Texcoco now. What had been an empty expanse of water and reeds was slowly, stone by stone, being transformed into something the world had never seen. The year was 1325, and the Mexica were no longer wanderers. They were builders, engineers, dreamers with mud on their hands and visions in their hearts. Picture the scene in those early years. The island that would become the heart of an empire was still small enough that a person could walk from one end to the other in the time it took to say a prayer. But already, the Mexica were thinking beyond the limits of land. They looked at the lake not as a barrier, but as a foundation. Where other peoples saw water, they saw possibility. The first great innovation was the chinampas, floating gardens that would feed a city yet to be born. Imagine the patient work of weaving together reeds and branches, of piling mud and lake-bottom muck into rectangular plots that bobbed gently on the surface of the water. These were not mere gardens, but islands of fertility created by human will and ingenuity. The rich black soil supported crops that grew with an abundance that seemed almost magical to visitors from the mainland. The women of the community were the first to understand the true potential of these floating gardens. They planted corn that grew tall and strong, its silk catching the morning breeze like prayers made visible. They cultivated beans that climbed toward the sun, squash that spread across the water's surface like green prayers, and tomatoes that hung heavy and red like the hearts of their gods. The Chinampas smelled of earth and growth, of life being coaxed from water and will. But it was the flowers that truly set Tenochtitlan apart. The Mexica had an almost mystical relationship with flowers. They believed that the gods themselves could be fed by their beauty and fragrance. Marigolds blazed like small suns across the Chinampas, their petals used in ceremonies that connected the earthly city to the divine realm. Amaranth grew in waves of deep red, its seeds ground into images of the gods that would be ceremonially consumed. The air itself seemed to shimmer with pollen and perfume, creating an atmosphere that visitors would describe as being somewhere between paradise and dream. The construction of the city proper was a feat of engineering that would have impressed the Romans. Since there was no stone on the island, every building material had to be brought by canoe from the mainland. Picture the endless procession of boats, each one loaded with dressed stone, timber, obsidian, and the countless other materials needed to build a civilization. The canoes moved through the morning mist like ghosts, their paddlers singing work songs that echoed across the water. The first temple was modest, a simple pyramid of stone and earth, but oriented with perfect precision to catch the rising sun. The priests who supervised its construction understood that they were not just building a place of worship, but creating a connection between the earthly realm and the world of the gods. Every stone was blessed, every measurement calculated not just for structural integrity, but for cosmic harmony. The marketplace began as a simple clearing where the Chinampas met the main island. But even in those early days, it bustled with an energy that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the growing city. Traders arrived by canoe from distant regions, their boats loaded with goods that sparkled like captured sunlight. Obsidian from the volcanic mountains, jade from the southern forests, cacao beans that were worth more than gold, and feathers from birds so rare that their colors seemed to have been stolen from the sunset itself. The sound of commerce was like music, the gentle splash of paddles, the calls of vendors announcing their wares, the soft clatter of obsidian beads being counted, the rustle of feathers being arranged for display. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter mixing with the cries of exotic birds brought from distant jungles. The air was thick with the scent of copal incense, chocolate being ground on stone metates, and the countless flowers that decorated every transaction. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of these early years was the development of the city's transportation system. The Mexica understood that a city built on water must move like water itself. They began construction of an intricate network of canals that would eventually connect every district of the city. These waterways were not just practical, they were beautiful, lined with stone steps and decorated with gardens that seemed to float on the surface of the water. The canoes themselves became works of art. The humblest fishing boat was carved with geometric patterns that caught the light like scales. The vessels of the nobility were painted in colors that seemed to glow with their own inner light, deep blues that mirrored the sky, greens that echoed the jungle, and reds that captured the essence of the setting sun. When the entire fleet moved together, it created a spectacle that seemed to transform the lake itself into a living, breathing work of art. The young warriors of the city spent their days learning to fight from these floating platforms. They would practice with wooden swords while standing in canoes that rocked with every movement, developing a balance and grace that would serve them well in the battles to come. Their training echoed across the water, the clash of wood on wood, the splash of bodies hitting the lake, the encouragement of instructors who understood that they were shaping not just fighters, but the future guardians of a civilization. As the sun set on these early years, the island city would transform into something that seemed almost supernatural. Torches reflected off the water, creating double images that made the settlement appear to float between the earthly lake and the starry sky. The smoke from cooking fires and temple incense created veils of mist that softened the edges of reality. Music drifted from the houses, flutes and drums that seemed to echo the rhythm of the waves themselves. The Mexica would gather in the central plaza as darkness fell, their faces lit by firelight, their voices joining in songs that spoke of their journey from the wilderness to this place of dreams. They sang of the eagle and the serpent, of the God who had led them through the desert, of the city that would rise from the lake like a vision made manifest. Their children listened with wide eyes, understanding that they were not just hearing stories, they were hearing the foundation myths of what would become the greatest empire the Americas had ever known. The lake lapped gently against the growing city, and in that sound the Mexica heard the promise of tomorrow. They had planted their dreams in the mud and water, and already they could see the first green shoots of empire beginning to grow. The morning mist clung to the lake like the breath of sleeping gods, and through it emerged the warriors of Tenochtitlan. But these were not the desperate fighters of a struggling settlement. These were the eagle and jaguar knights of a growing power, their bodies painted with the colors of divine wrath, their weapons gleaming with the dark fire of volcanic glass. The year was 1428, and the Mexica had learned their first and most important lesson. In the Valley of Mexico, strength was not just survival, it was the currency of respect. The surrounding city-states had watched the growth of Tenochtitlan with growing unease. What had begun as amusement at the barbarians building their city on a swamp had transformed into something approaching fear. The island city was no longer content to merely exist. It had begun to hunger. Picture the preparation for what the Mexica called the Flower Wars, Xochimilquistli in their musical tongue. These were not the desperate battles of conquest, but something far more sophisticated and terrifying. They were ritual conflicts, sacred dances of death designed to capture enemies for the gods, while simultaneously demonstrating the growing power of Tenochtitlan. The very name spoke to the Mexica understanding of war as both art and necessity, beautiful, deadly, and essential as the flowers that bloomed on their chinampas. The warriors prepared in silence that was more profound than any battle cry. In the pre-dawn darkness, they painted their bodies with designs that told stories of their lineage, their achievements, their hopes for glory. The Eagle Knights adorned themselves with feathers that seemed to capture the very essence of flight. Brown and gold and white, arranged in patterns that made their wearers appear to soar even while standing still. The Jaguar Knights painted their skin with spots that caught the firelight, their movements fluid and predatory as they prepared for the hunt. The weapons themselves were masterpieces of craftsmanship that blurred the line between art and lethality. The Macuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with obsidian blades, was sharp enough to decapitate a horse, yet decorated with intricate carvings that spoke of the warrior's devotion to the gods. The obsidian fragments caught the light like captured stars, each one knapped by master craftsmen who understood that every blow must be both deadly and beautiful. The very sound of these weapons cutting through air was like a whisper from the wind god himself. The shields were canvases of compressed cotton and leather, painted with symbols that blazed with meaning. A warrior's shield told his story, his victories, his patron deities, his place in the cosmic order. The colors were made from minerals and plants that had been gathered with ceremony, ground with prayer and applied with the reverence due to sacred art. When the morning sun struck these shields, they seemed to glow with divine light, transforming the warriors into living icons of their gods. The enemy approached across the causeway that connected the island city to the mainland. Warriors from Texcoco, painted for their own gods, carrying their own dreams of glory. But there was something different about this conflict. Both sides understood that this was not about territory or treasure in the conventional sense. This was about the cosmic order itself, about feeding the gods the precious water of life that flowed in human veins. The battle began with a sound that seemed to tear the very air, the war cry of the Mexica, a sound that combined the scream of eagles with the roar of jaguars. It echoed across the lake, bouncing off the water and the surrounding mountains until it seemed as if the earth itself was crying out for blood. The enemy answered with their own calls, and for a moment the air itself seemed to shimmer with the power of human voices raised in divine fury. The fighting was like a deadly dance, each movement choreographed by generations of training and tradition. Warriors sought not to kill their enemies outright, but to wound and capture them, to take them alive for the ceremonies that would follow. The obsidian blades drew lines of red across painted skin, each cut deliberate and precise. The clash of shields created a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the city itself. But it was the aftermath that truly revealed the nature of Mexican warfare. The captured warriors were not treated as mere prisoners, they were transformed into divine messengers, chosen to carry the prayers of the people directly to the gods. The ceremonies that followed were elaborate beyond imagination, involving days of preparation, purification, and ritual that culminated in the most sacred act the Mexica knew, the offering of human life to sustain the universe itself. The temple of Huitzilopochtli rose from the center of the city like a mountain made by human hands, its steps steep and narrow, slick with the blood of countless offerings. The captured warriors climbed these steps with dignity, understanding that they were participating in something far greater than their individual lives. They were becoming part of the cosmic machinery that kept the sun rising, the rains falling, the world itself turning in its eternal dance. The priests who conducted these ceremonies were artists of the sacred, their bodies painted with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the firelight. They moved with the precision of dancers, their obsidian knives flashing like captured lightning. The heart, when it was finally removed, was still beating, a gift so precious that it was believed to carry the warrior's courage directly to the gods. The blood that flowed down the temple steps was not seen as death, but as the ultimate expression of life, the red river that connected the earthly realm to the divine. The people of Tenochtitlan watched these ceremonies with reverence that bordered on ecstasy. They understood that they were witnessing the fundamental transaction that kept their world functioning. The gods gave them life, fertility, protection, and victory. In return, they offered the most precious thing they possessed, human life itself, given freely and with perfect ritual precision. The success of these early conflicts transformed Tenochtitlan in ways that went far beyond military victory. The city began to attract allies, traders, and ambitious young warriors from throughout the valley. The island that had once been dismissed as a swamp began to be spoken of with respect, then with awe, and finally with something approaching terror. The markets grew more elaborate, filled with the spoils of victory and the tribute of intimidated neighbors. Jade from the south, turquoise from the north, cacao from the tropical lowlands, and feathers from birds that lived in clouds. The merchants who brought these treasures spoke in hushed tones of the city that seemed to float on the water, of the warriors who fought like gods, of the ceremonies that made the very air shimmer with divine power. As the sun set on these early victories, the priests of Tenochtitlan climbed to the top of their pyramid to offer the evening prayers. The view from this height was breathtaking. The lake stretched in all directions, dotted with the lights of distant cities, crisscrossed by the wakes of countless canoes. But it was the sight of their own city that truly filled them with awe. The canals reflected the sunset like rivers of gold. The chinampas seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the smoke from thousands of cooking fires created a gentle haze that made the entire city appear to exist somewhere between earth and heaven. The flower wars had taught the Mexica their most important lesson. They were not just another city-state struggling for survival in a crowded valley. They were the chosen people of the war god, destined to create an empire that would stretch from sea to sea, sustained by the blood of their enemies and blessed by the gods themselves. The lake lapped gently against the growing city, and in that sound, the Mexica heard the whisper of destiny calling them toward a glory that would make the earth itself tremble with their power. The morning sun painted the lake of Texcoco in shades of gold and amber, and across its surface moved the most significant gathering the valley had ever seen. Canoes from 3 great cities converged on the island of Tenochtitlan, their banners streaming in the morning breeze like prayers made visible. The year was 1428, and the Mexica were about to transform from a rising power into the cornerstone of the greatest empire the Americas had ever known. The delegation from Texcoco arrived first, their canoes painted in blues and whites that seemed to capture the very essence of the sky reflected in water. These were the scholars and engineers of the valley, the keepers of knowledge who had built their city into a center of learning that rivaled the great libraries of the ancient world. Their leader, Nezahualcoyotl, was a poet king whose words could move hearts and whose engineering projects could move mountains. He came to this meeting carrying scrolls covered in calculations that would reshape the very landscape of the valley. From the south came the representatives of Tlacopan, their vessels decorated with the green and gold of fertile fields and abundant harvests. They were the agricultural masters of the region, the people who understood better than any other how to coax life from the soil, how to read the subtle signs of weather and season, how to feed the growing populations that would soon stretch across 2 continents. Their gifts to the alliance would be measured not in warriors or gold, but in the ability to transform wilderness into farmland, to make the desert bloom. But it was the arrival of the Mexica delegation that truly captured the imagination of all who witnessed it. The warriors of Tenochtitlan moved across the water like living flames, their feathered regalia catching the morning light until they seemed to be made of fire and air. Their leader, Itzcoatl, carried himself with the dignity of a man who had spoken with gods, who had seen the future in the patterns of smoke and blood, who understood that this meeting would echo through the ages. The negotiations took place in the greatest hall that Tenochtitlan had yet constructed, a building that seemed to float on the water itself. The walls were decorated with murals that told the story of the 3 cities, their struggles, their victories, their dreams of a future that would dwarf the achievements of the past. The air was thick with copal incense and the scent of flowers, creating an atmosphere that seemed to lift the proceedings beyond the merely political into the realm of the sacred. The terms of the alliance were elegant in their simplicity. Tenochtitlan would provide the military might that would expand and defend the empire. Their warriors had proven themselves in the flower wars, and their devotion to the god of war was absolute. Texcoco would contribute the intellectual and administrative framework that would hold the empire together. Their scholars would design the systems of tribute and governance that would allow diverse peoples to be united under a single rule. Tlacopan would ensure that the growing empire could feed itself, that the agricultural techniques that had made the valley prosperous could be extended to every corner of the known world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Triple Alliance was what it represented in terms of cultural synthesis. The Mexica brought their fierce devotion to the gods of war, their understanding of the cosmic necessity of sacrifice, their vision of empire as a sacred duty. Texcoco contributed their love of learning, their sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy, their belief that knowledge was the highest form of power. Tlacopan added their deep connection to the earth, their practical wisdom about the cycles of planting and harvest, their understanding that all empire must ultimately rest on the foundation of adequate food. The ceremony that formalized the alliance was conducted at sunrise, when the first rays of light struck the peak of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. The three rulers stood together on the platform at the summit, their blood mingling as they made cuts with obsidian blades, blessed by the priests of all three cities. The blood fell onto a brazier filled with copal and rare woods, creating smoke that rose straight up into the morning sky, carrying their vows to the gods themselves. The transformation of the valley was immediate and profound. The isolated city-states that had spent centuries in petty warfare suddenly found themselves faced with a unified power that could field armies larger than any they had ever imagined. The tribute system that had once been a matter of occasional raids became a sophisticated network of collection and redistribution that would make the Valley of Mexico the wealthiest region in the Americas. The first great test of the alliance came with the conquest of the Tepanec capital of Azcapotzalco. This was the city that had once dominated the valley, that had treated the Mexica as useful barbarians, that had never imagined that the island dwellers could pose a serious threat. The siege that followed was a masterpiece of coordinated warfare, with Mexica warriors providing the shock troops, Texcocan engineers designing the siege works, and Tlacopan supplying the food and materials needed to sustain a long campaign. The fall of Azcapotzalco sent shock waves throughout the region. The city that had seemed impregnable was reduced to rubble in a matter of months. The survivors were given a choice: submit to the alliance and contribute to its growing power, or face the same fate as their former masters. Most chose submission, understanding that resistance would only delay the inevitable while ensuring their own destruction. The spoils of victory were distributed according to the agreements of the alliance, but the real treasure was not gold or jade. It was the knowledge that the system worked. The Triple Alliance had proven that it could unite diverse peoples under a single rule, that it could project power across vast distances, that it could transform defeat into submission and submission into strength. The markets of Tenochtitlan exploded with new wealth and variety. Merchants arrived from regions that had never before traded with the valley, bringing goods that seemed to come from the realm of dreams, tropical fruits that tasted like sunshine, birds whose feathers held every color of the rainbow, precious stones that seemed to capture light and hold it forever. The sound of commerce became a symphony that played from dawn to dusk, with the calls of vendors mixing with the splash of canoes and the gentle music of flutes and drums. The intellectual flowering that followed was equally remarkable. The scribes of Texcoco began the great project of recording the history and traditions of all the peoples who had joined the alliance. The sacred books grew in number and complexity, filled with mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and poetic texts that captured the spiritual essence of the new empire. The very concept of knowledge began to expand, as scholars from different traditions shared their understanding of everything from medicine to architecture. The agricultural innovations spread across the landscape like a green wave of prosperity. The Chinampa system that had fed Tenochtitlan was adapted to lakes and rivers throughout the empire. New crops were introduced from conquered territories, creating a diversity of food that would support populations larger than any the region had ever known. The sight of the valley from the air would have been breathtaking, a patchwork of green fields, blue canals, and white cities that seemed to pulse with life and energy. But perhaps the most profound change was in the consciousness of the people themselves. The residents of Tenochtitlan no longer saw themselves as inhabitants of a single city, but as citizens of an empire that stretched beyond the horizon. The young warriors who had once dreamed of glory in local conflicts now imagined themselves conquering distant lands, bringing new peoples into the embrace of the alliance, expanding the boundaries of the known world. As the sun set on these early years of the Triple Alliance, the three rulers would meet on the pyramid of Tenochtitlan to offer the evening prayers. The view from this height revealed the transformation that their partnership had wrought. The lake was covered with the lights of canoes carrying goods to and from the growing empire. The surrounding mountains were dotted with the fires of new settlements. And in the distance, barely visible in the gathering dusk, were the roads that would carry the power of the Alliance to the ends of the earth. The Alliance had given birth to something unprecedented in the history of the Americas, a true empire, united not just by conquest but by shared vision, sustained not just by tribute but by genuine cooperation, blessed not just by the gods of war but by the deities of knowledge and fertility as well. Before the sun had fully risen over the lake of Texcoco, the sound of young warriors training echoed across the water, like a prayer made of sweat and determination. In the Camacaq and Telpochcali, the elite and common schools of Tenochtitlan, boys who had barely learned to walk were beginning their transformation into the eagles and jaguars that would carry the empire's power to the edges of the world. Picture a boy of 7 summers, his small hands gripping a wooden sword that seems almost too heavy for his thin arms. His name is Tlacaelel, and he dreams of the day when he will wear the feathered regalia of an eagle knight, when his face will be painted with the colors of victory, when his name will be spoken with the reverence reserved for those who have fed the gods with the blood of their enemies. But for now he is simply a child learning to balance on the narrow causeways that connect the city to the mainland, his instructor's voice sharp as obsidian as it cuts through the morning air. The education of a warrior began not with weapons, but with the understanding of cosmic purpose. The boys were taught that they were not merely soldiers, but servants of the gods, chosen to maintain the delicate balance that kept the sun rising and the world turning. They learned the stories of the gods, how Huitzilopochtli had led their people from the wilderness, how Tezcatlipoca had created the world through conflict and struggle, how Quetzalcoatl had given them the gifts of civilization and learning. The physical training was brutal in its precision. The boys learned to run across the floating chinampas without disturbing the delicate plants, to balance on the narrow prows of war canoes while wielding weapons, to read the subtle signs of weather and terrain that could mean the difference between victory and death. Their bodies were hardened by exposure to cold and heat, their endurance tested by races that lasted from dawn to dusk, their courage measured by their willingness to face pain without crying out. But it was the spiritual preparation that truly set the Mexica warriors apart from their enemies. The boys learned to fast for days at a time, to pierce their flesh with maguey thorns as offerings to the gods, to enter into trance states where they could commune with the divine forces that governed war and victory. They were taught that their bodies were merely vessels for the will of the gods, that their individual lives were less important than the cosmic drama in which they played their parts. The weapons training was an art form that blurred the line between combat and ceremony. The maquahuitl, the obsidian-edged sword that could cut through bone as easily as flesh, was not merely a tool of war, but a sacred instrument that connected the warrior to the gods of battle. The boys learned to treat their weapons with the reverence due to holy relics, to sharpen the obsidian blades with prayers, to understand that every stroke must be both deadly and beautiful. The atlatl, the spear thrower that could propel a dart with the force of a lightning bolt, required years of practice to master. The boys would spend hours learning to coordinate the complex movements of arm and wrist that would allow them to strike enemies at distances that seemed impossible. The sound of practiced darts striking wooden targets created a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the city itself, a percussion that spoke of power held in careful restraint. The shields were works of art as much as protection. Each warrior's shield told his story, his family history, his achievements, his dreams of glory. The boys learned to paint these shields with pigments made from precious minerals, to arrange feathers in patterns that would catch the light of battle, to understand that their shield was not just armor, but a canvas on which they would paint their legacy. The advancement through the warrior ranks was marked by ceremonies that seemed to transform the participants from ordinary humans into living embodiments of divine power. The first capture in battle was celebrated with rituals that lasted for days, with the young warrior's family and friends gathering to witness his transformation from boy to man. The painting of his face with the colors of victory was performed by the priests themselves, each stroke imbued with prayers and blessings. The Eagle Knights represented the pinnacle of warrior achievement, their regalia so magnificent that they seemed to have captured the very essence of flight. The costume was made from the feathers of hundreds of birds, each one selected for its color and symbolic meaning. The helmet was carved to resemble the head of an eagle, with obsidian eyes that seemed to see into the realm of the gods. When an Eagle Knight moved, the feathers created a rustling sound that seemed to echo the wind through mountain peaks. The Jaguar Knights were equally impressive, their spotted costumes making them appear to move like shadows given form. The Jaguar represented the power of the earth, the silent hunter who struck from darkness, the guardian of the mysteries that lay hidden in the heart of the jungle. Their training was different from that of the Eagle Knights, where the eagles learned to soar and strike from above. The jaguars learned to stalk and pounce, to become one with the shadows, to move through enemy territory like whispers of death. The ceremonies that elevated warriors to these elite ranks were spectacles that seemed to transform the very air of Tenochtitlan. The candidate would fast for 20 days, his body purified by abstinence and prayer. On the final day, he would climb the steps of the Great Pyramid at dawn, his skin painted with the sacred symbols of his chosen order. At the summit, the priests would perform rituals that seemed to call down the gods themselves, anointing the warrior with blood and copal smoke, dressing him in regalia that had been blessed by every deity in the pantheon. The training never truly ended, even for the most accomplished warriors. They continued to practice their skills daily, understanding that the empire's survival depended on their constant readiness. The sound of obsidian striking obsidian could be heard throughout the city as warriors sparred with their deadly blades, their movements so precise that they seemed to be performing a dance rather than preparing for combat. The younger boys watched these practices with eyes that burned with ambition. They saw not just men training, but gods walking among mortals, their bodies transformed by years of discipline into instruments of divine will. The sight of an Eagle Knight in full regalia could move children to tears of awe, while the silent passage of a jaguar warrior through the market could make even hardened merchants step aside with reverence. The war songs that accompanied training were themselves works of art, complex compositions that told the stories of great battles, celebrated the deeds of legendary warriors, and invoked the protection of the gods. The boys learned these songs by heart, understanding that the words themselves had power, that the proper recitation could strengthen their arms, sharpen their reflexes, and fill their hearts with the courage of their ancestors. The mock battles that served as final examinations were spectacles that drew crowds from throughout the city. These were not simple exercises, but elaborate recreations of famous victories, complete with costumes representing enemy warriors and scenarios that tested every aspect of a young warrior's training. The boys who excelled in these contests were marked for advancement, their names recorded in the sacred books, their futures mapped out on paths that led to glory and honor. But it was the spiritual dimension of warrior training that truly set the Mexica apart. The boys learned that they were not just learning to fight, They were learning to participate in the cosmic struggle that kept the universe in balance. Every enemy they captured, every drop of blood they shed, every act of courage they performed was part of a grand design that stretched from the deepest underworld to the highest heavens. The weapons themselves were treated as living beings with personalities and preferences that the warriors had to learn and respect. A warrior's makwahwitl was not just a tool, but a partner in the dance of death, an extension of his own soul that required constant care and attention. The obsidian blades were resharpened with ceremony, the wooden hafts oiled with sacred unguents, the bindings replaced with threads that had been blessed by the priests. The philosophy of warfare that emerged from this training was sophisticated beyond anything that existed elsewhere in the Americas. The Mexica understood that true victory came not from the destruction of enemies, but from their transformation into allies. The goal of battle was not slaughter, but capture, not annihilation, but incorporation. The warriors learned to fight with restraint, to disable rather than kill, to preserve the lives that would later be offered to the gods in proper ceremony. The code of honor that governed these warriors was as complex as any legal system. They were forbidden to strike an enemy from behind, to attack the wounded, or to take credit for another's achievements. The punishment for cowardice was not death, but something worse: exile from the city, separation from the cosmic order that gave life meaning. A warrior who fled from battle was considered to be spiritually dead, cut off from the gods and from the community that defined his existence. As the sun reached its zenith on any given day in Tenochtitlan, the training grounds would fall silent for the midday prayers. The warriors, young and old, would face the Great Pyramid and offer thanks to the gods who had given them strength, skill, and purpose. In those moments of silence, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing that these men were the living embodiment of its power, the human instruments through which the will of the gods would be made manifest in the world. The evening brought different exercises, night fighting techniques, stealth maneuvers, the complex coordination required for amphibious assaults from war canoes. The warriors learned to move in darkness like spirits, to read the stars for navigation, to understand the subtle sounds that revealed the presence of enemies. The night training was whispered about in other cities, where people spoke in hushed tones of Mexica warriors who could appear and disappear like shadows, who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. The bonds formed between warriors during this training lasted for life. They learned to fight not just as individuals, but as units, their movements coordinated with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The sight of a squadron of eagle knights moving in formation was like watching a single organism with many parts, each warrior knowing instinctively where his companions would be, what they would do, how their combined efforts would create a force greater than the sum of its parts. As darkness fell over the training grounds, the young warriors would gather around fires to hear the stories of their elders. These were not mere entertainment, but sacred texts that preserved the wisdom of generations, tales of battles fought and won, of heroes who had transcended mortality through their deeds, of the cosmic purpose that gave meaning to every scar and every victory. The lake reflected the firelight like a mirror, and in its depths the young warriors could see their own futures reflected, paths of glory that led through conquest and sacrifice to the ultimate honor of joining the gods themselves. They were no longer just boys from Tenochtitlan. They were the living weapons of empire, the human instruments through which the Mexica would reshape the world. In the time before the Mexica ruled the valley, when the pyramids of Teotihuacan still echoed with the prayers of a vanished people, there lived a god whose very name seemed to contain the promise of wisdom and the threat of transformation. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, moved through the mythology of Mesoamerica, like wind through jade leaves, carrying with him the secrets of creation, the gifts of civilization, and the burden of prophecy that would one day shake the foundations of the Aztec Empire. Picture the morning when the priests of Tenochtitlan climbed the steps of their newest temple, dedicated not to the fierce Huitzilopochtli, but to this more complex deity, whose influence stretched back to the dawn of time. The temple was different from the others. Its stones were carved not with images of war and sacrifice, but with symbols that spoke of learning, of the movement of stars, of the delicate balance between earth and sky that Quetzalcoatl represented. The god himself was a contradiction that seemed to embody the very essence of Mesoamerican spirituality. He was both serpent and bird, earth and air, wisdom and wildness. In the codices painted by scribes whose hands trembled with reverence, Quetzalcoatl appeared as a figure of terrible beauty, his body covered with the green feathers of the Quetzal bird, his face painted with the blue of deep water and distant sky, his eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect the movement of time itself. The legends spoke of a time when Quetzalcoatl had walked the earth as a man, ruling the city of Tollan with wisdom that made the very stones sing with harmony. Under his guidance, the people had learned to grow cotton in colors that rivaled the rainbow, to work gold with such skill that their ornaments seemed to capture the essence of the sun, to calculate the movements of Venus with a precision that allowed them to predict eclipses generations in advance. But the stories also spoke of the god's great weakness, his refusal to demand human sacrifice, his belief that the gods could be nourished by offerings of flowers, jade, and butterflies. This compassion, beautiful though it was, had made him vulnerable to the machinations of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of conflict who understood that creation required destruction, that life demanded death, that the universe could only be sustained through the constant offering of blood. The tale of Quetzalcoatl's fall was told in the Kamicac schools with the solemnity of a funeral rite. The young nobles learned how Tezcatlipoca had appeared to the feathered serpent in the form of an old man, bearing a mirror that revealed the god's own mortality. For the first time, Quetzalcoatl saw himself as he truly was, no longer young, no longer perfect, marked by the passage of time that affects even the divine. In his horror and shame, the god had accepted the stranger's gift of pulque, the fermented drink that clouded judgment and loosened the bonds of propriety. What followed was a night of madness that ended the golden age of Tollan. Quetzalcoatl, drunk and disgraced, had violated his own sacred laws, bringing shame upon himself and chaos upon his city. When dawn came and sobriety returned, the god found himself face to face with the consequences of his weakness. The only honorable path was exile, a journey to the eastern sea where he would burn himself on a funeral pyre and transform into the morning star. But the prophecy that accompanied his departure was what made the priests of Tenochtitlan shiver even as they offered their prayers. Quetzalcoatl had sworn to return in the year Sheacatl, one reed, sailing from the east with pale skin and a dark beard, bringing with him either the restoration of the Golden Age or the destruction of everything the Mexica had built. The god's final words echoed through the centuries like thunder rolling across the mountains. "I will return, and my arrival will mark the end of your dominion." The year Xiacatl in the Mexica calendar corresponded to what the distant Europeans would call 1519, and as that fateful date approached, the empire trembled with portents that seemed to announce the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. The priests recorded omens that made even the bravest warriors pale with fear. A comet that burned in the sky like a wound in the fabric of night, a temple that burst into flames without cause, a woman who walked the streets of Tenochtitlan weeping for her children who were not yet dead. The market vendors whispered of strange dreams that visited them in the hours before dawn. visions of men with pale skin and hair on their faces, riding deer as large as houses, wielding weapons that spoke with the voice of thunder. The fishermen on the lake reported seeing lights beneath the water, as if Tlaloc himself were moving his underwater palace in preparation for some cosmic change. In the Karmakak, the young nobles studied the ancient texts with new urgency, searching for clues that might help them understand what was coming. The scribes worked by candlelight, their fingers stained with the pigments they used to record every prophecy, every omen, every fragment of wisdom that might illuminate the darkness that seemed to be approaching from the east. The worship of Quetzalcoatl in Tenochtitlan had always been tinged with melancholy, a recognition that the god's gifts came with the price of eventual loss. The temples dedicated to the feathered serpent were filled with flowers rather than blood, their altars adorned with jade and turquoise rather than human hearts. The priests who served these temples were scholars and astronomers, men who read the future in the movements of planets and the patterns of wind across the lake. But even as they honored Quetzalcoatl's memory, the people of Tenochtitlan never forgot that their primary allegiance was to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war who had led them from the wilderness to empire. The feathered serpent might represent wisdom and civilization, but it was the hummingbird on the left who had given them the strength to conquer their enemies and build their floating city into the wonder of the world. The tension between these two divine influences created a complexity in Mexica spirituality that was reflected in every aspect of their culture. They were fierce warriors who created poetry of stunning beauty, bloody conquerors who built schools that preserved the wisdom of the ages, pragmatic empire builders who lived in constant awareness of the cosmic forces that surrounded them. The children of Tenochtitlan grew up with this duality as a fundamental part of their worldview. They learned to honor both the warrior's path and the scholar's wisdom, to understand that strength without knowledge was mere brutality, while knowledge without the will to act was impotent. The city itself embodied this balance, its pyramids rising toward the war god while its libraries preserved the teachings of the feathered serpent. As the fateful year Seacatl approached, the Emperor Moctezuma Sect found himself caught between these competing influences. He was the inheritor of Huitzilopochtli's legacy, the commander of armies that had never known defeat, the ruler of an empire that stretched from sea to sea. But he was also a scholar who had studied the ancient prophecies, a man who understood that even the mightiest empire was subject to the will of the gods. The rituals conducted in the temples of Quetzalcoatl during these final years of the empire's glory took on a desperate intensity. The priests offered elaborate ceremonies designed to placate the returning god, to convince him that the Mexica were worthy heirs to his legacy of wisdom and civilization. They burned mountains of copal incense, offered rivers of pulque, and arranged displays of featherwork that seemed to capture the very essence of the divine bird serpent. But underneath the formal ceremonies, a deeper current of fear flowed through the city like an underground river. The people sensed that an age was ending, that the cosmic wheel was turning toward a transformation that would sweep away everything they had known and loved. The very success of their empire had become a burden, for they understood that what had been built by the will of the gods could just as easily be destroyed by divine judgment. As the sun set on the empire's final years of peace, the priests of both Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl climbed their respective pyramids to offer the evening prayers. From their height, they could see the entire Valley of Mexico spread before them, the lake dotted with the lights of countless canoes, the mountains purple in the gathering dusk, the cities that acknowledged the supremacy of Tenochtitlan twinkling like earthbound stars. It was a sight that filled them with pride and terror in equal measure. They had built something unprecedented in the history of the world, an empire that was both a political entity and a sacred space, a civilization that had achieved the perfect balance between earth and heaven. But they also knew that balance was fragile, that the very perfection of their achievement made it vulnerable to the cosmic forces that demanded change, transformation, and renewal. The wind that blew across the lake that evening carried with it the scent of flowers and blood, of incense and distant rain, of the 1,000 different elements that made Tenochtitlan the wonder of the world. But to those who knew how to read the signs, it also carried something else. The first faint whisper of the storm that was approaching from the east, the breath of the returning god who would bring with him either salvation or destruction. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, where the morning light fell through carved stone windows onto floors polished smooth as mirrors, sat a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger, was the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, the mortal voice of the gods on earth. But as the year Teocatl approached, the man who ruled the mightiest empire in the Americas found himself haunted by dreams that tasted of ash and endings. Picture the emperor in the quiet hour before dawn, when the city still slept and the lake lay still as polished obsidian. He stood on the highest terrace of his palace, wrapped in a feathered cloak that seemed to capture the very essence of the morning sky. At 54, Moctezuma was still tall and elegant, his bearing regal even in solitude. But there were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and his hands, when he thought no one was watching, trembled slightly as they held the sacred scrolls that contained the prophecies of his people. The palace that surrounded him was a wonder that left foreign ambassadors speechless with awe. Every room was a masterpiece of art and engineering, with walls covered in murals that seemed to move in the flickering light of torch flames. The gardens were arranged in patterns that mirrored the movements of the stars, filled with flowers that bloomed in every color imaginable, and birds that sang with voices sweeter than any human music. Water flowed through channels carved from single blocks of stone, creating a gentle sound that seemed to ease the burdens of those who walked these halls. But it was the throne room that truly captured the majesty of the Aztec Empire. The chamber was vast enough to hold 1,000 supplicants, its ceiling supported by columns carved to resemble the trunks of sacred cecropia trees. The walls were covered with shields and weapons taken from defeated enemies, each one a trophy that told the story of the empire's expansion. At the far end of the room, raised on a platform of polished jade, sat the throne itself, a seat carved from a single block of volcanic stone and cushioned with the finest feathers in the world. From this throne, Moctezuma ruled an empire that stretched from the tropical lowlands of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec to the mountains of the distant north. His word was law in hundreds of cities. His tribute collectors were feared and respected from coast to coast. His armies had never known defeat. The wealth that flowed into Tenochtitlan was beyond imagination. Gold from riverbeds, silver from mountain mines, jade from hidden quarries, and feathers from birds so rare that a single plume was worth more than a commoner's house. Yet for all his power, Moctezuma was a man tormented by uncertainty. The ancient prophecies that had been preserved in the sacred books spoke clearly of the return of Quetzalcoatl in the year Teocatl, and that fateful date was approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. The emperor had consulted every priest, every astronomer, every wise man in his vast dominions, but none could tell him whether the returning god would come as friend or destroyer. The daily routine of empire provided some distraction from these cosmic concerns. Each morning brought audiences with tribute collectors returning from distant provinces, their tales of submission and wealth helping to maintain the illusion that human power could stand against divine will. The emperor would sit on his throne, magnificently robed and crowned with feathers that caught the light like captured rainbows, while nobles and commoners alike approached on their knees to seek his judgment. The tribute itself was staggering in its variety and abundance. From the tropical south came cacao beans, vanilla pods, and precious feathers that seemed to hold the very essence of paradise. From the northern mountains came turquoise and silver, copper bells that rang with voices like fallen stars, and obsidian so pure it seemed to be made of crystallized darkness. From the coasts came shells that whispered of distant oceans, salt that preserved life itself, and cotton so fine it seemed woven from clouds. But it was the human tribute that weighed most heavily on Moctezuma's mind. The empire's appetite for sacrificial victims was enormous, requiring a constant stream of prisoners taken in war or donated by subject peoples. The emperor understood the cosmic necessity of these offerings. The gods required nourishment, the sun needed blood to rise each morning. The rains would not fall without the proper ceremonies. Yet he could not escape the growing sense that this system, for all its sacred importance, was somehow connected to the approaching crisis. The administrative complexity of the empire was mind-boggling. From his palace in Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma oversaw a bureaucracy that would have impressed the Romans. Tax collectors, judges, military commanders, and provincial governors all reported to the central government through a system of runners who could carry messages across the empire faster than horses. The royal archives contained detailed records of every tribute payment, every legal decision, every military campaign, a paper trail that documented the rise of the greatest empire the Americas had ever known. The emperor's personal routine was itself a form of religious ceremony. He bathed 4 times daily in water that had been blessed by the priests, his body anointed with oils made from precious flowers and rare herbs. His clothing was changed with each bath, the discarded garments too sacred to be worn by any mortal man more than once. His meals were prepared by chefs who had trained for years to achieve the perfect balance of flavors that befit a divine palate, served on plates of gold and silver, while musicians played melodies that had been composed specifically for royal consumption. Yet for all this luxury, Moctezuma lived a life of profound isolation. Royal protocol forbade any but the highest nobles from looking directly at his face, and even they had to approach barefoot and with eyes downcast. The emperor ate alone, slept alone, and bore the burden of his decisions in solitude that would have driven lesser men to madness. His only true companions were the priests and advisors who shared his burden of cosmic responsibility, men who understood that the fate of the world hung on their ability to maintain the delicate balance between human will and divine intention. The reports from the eastern provinces had been growing stranger by the month. Merchants spoke of great winged houses that moved across the water without paddles, of pale-skinned men with hair on their faces who spoke in unknown tongues. The coastal lords sent messages describing weapons that spoke with thunder, animals larger than deer that carried men on their backs, and metal that gleamed like water but held edges sharper than obsidian. Each new report sent Moctezuma deeper into the sacred texts, searching for clues that might help him understand what was approaching. The scribes worked day and night, copying and recopying the ancient prophecies, looking for nuances of meaning that might have been overlooked. The astronomers climbed their towers to study the movements of Venus, calculating and recalculating the cycles that would determine whether the returning god came in peace or wrath. The dreams that visited the emperor in his few hours of sleep were vivid beyond description. He saw the city burning, its pyramids crumbling into the lake while screams echoed across the water. He saw foreign warriors pouring through the streets like ants, their weapons cutting down his people with ease. But he also saw other visions, himself kneeling before a pale figure who spoke with the voice of Quetzalcoatl, the empire transformed but not destroyed, a new age dawning with himself as its herald. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Moctezuma had been trained from birth to make decisions that affected millions, to bear responsibility that would crush ordinary men. But this was different. This was not a matter of military strategy or political maneuvering. This was about the fundamental nature of reality itself, about prophecies that stretched back to the creation of the world. The royal menagerie provided some escape from these cosmic concerns. Moctezuma maintained a zoo that was larger and more diverse than any in the world, filled with every creature that lived within his empire, and many that had been brought from distant lands as tribute. He would walk among the caged jaguars and pumas, listening to their breathing, finding in their wild dignity a reflection of his own trapped power. The aviaries were filled with birds of every color and song, their music a symphony that seemed to echo the voice of creation itself. But even these moments of peace were haunted by omens. The animals had been restless lately, the jaguars pacing endlessly in their cages, the birds falling silent at unexpected moments. The keepers whispered of strange behaviors, of creatures that seemed to sense something approaching that human awareness could not yet detect. The council meetings had taken on a desperate quality as the year Si-Acatl drew near. The greatest minds in the empire gathered in chambers where the air was thick with copal incense and tension, debating interpretations of prophecy with the passion of men whose lives hung on the outcome. Some argued that the pale strangers from the east were merely unusual traders, men from distant lands who posed no threat to the mighty Aztec Empire. Others insisted that these were harbingers of Quetzalcoatl's return, divine messengers who deserved to be welcomed with all the honor due to gods. Moctezuma found himself caught between these viewpoints, his trained political instincts warring with his deep religious convictions. The emperor who had expanded the empire to its greatest extent, who had built the most magnificent capital the world had ever seen, who commanded armies that could crush any earthly enemy, found himself paralyzed by uncertainty in the face of the returning god. As the sun set on another day of waiting and worry, Moctezuma would climb to the highest tower of his palace to offer the evening prayers. From this height, he could see the entire extent of his floating city, the canals that carried the lifeblood of commerce, the pyramids that reached toward the realm of the gods, the countless lights that spoke of a civilization at the height of its power. It was a sight that should have filled him with pride and confidence. Instead, it filled him with a profound sadness that seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. He loved this city, this empire, this people with a passion that went beyond duty or honor, but he could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon them all like a mountain of stone. The year Teocatl was coming, and with it, the end of everything he had known and loved. The morning of February 18th, 1519, dawned like any other on the coast of what the Mexica called the Divine Waters, the endless blue expanse that stretched beyond the horizon where Quetzalcoatl had vanished into legend. But on this morning, the fishermen who cast their nets in the shallow lagoons near the island of Cozumel saw something that made their hearts stop with terror and wonder. Great houses floating on the water, their white wings spread like the feathers of impossible birds, moving against the wind with a grace that could only be divine. Picture the scene as the news traveled from village to village, carried by runners whose feet had never moved so fast, whose voices had never carried such urgent whispers. The ships, for that's what these floating palaces were, though no one in the Americas had ever seen their like, rode the waves like living creatures, their wooden hulls cutting through water with a sound like distant thunder. From their sides protruded long wooden poles that gleamed with metal, and on their decks moved figures that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. The leader of these strangers was a man whose very appearance seemed to fulfill the ancient prophecies. Hernán Cortés was tall and lean, his skin pale as moonlight, his beard dark as the obsidian that tipped Mexica spears. When he stood on the prow of his flagship, wrapped in armor that caught the sun like captured water, he looked exactly like the descriptions of Quetzalcoatl returning from his exile in the east. Even his manner of speaking, through an interpreter, in words that seemed to carry the weight of divine authority, echoed the legends of the feathered serpent. The coastal peoples who first encountered these strangers were caught between terror and reverence. The visitors possessed weapons that spoke with the voice of thunder, animals larger than the greatest deer that carried men on their backs as if they were living mountains, and metal so perfectly crafted it seemed to flow like water, yet held edges sharper than any obsidian. Most disturbing of all, they showed no interest in the flowers and incense that should have satisfied divine beings, instead demanding gold with an hunger that seemed to burn in their pale eyes like fever. The messages that traveled inland to Tenochtitlan grew more fantastic with each telling. The coastal lords sent tribute bearers carrying paintings on bark paper that showed the strangers in all their terrifying glory. Bearded faces that had never known human form, bodies wrapped in silver scales like serpents, weapons that breathed fire and smoke. The artists had tried to capture the impossible, but their pigments seemed inadequate to convey the otherworldly nature of what they had witnessed. Moctezuma received these reports in the great hall of his palace, surrounded by advisors, whose faces reflected his own mixture of fear and fascination. The emperor studied each painting with the intensity of a priest reading sacred omens, searching for clues that might tell him whether these beings came as destroyers or as the returning gods of prophecy. The resemblance to Quetzalcoatl was unmistakable, the timing, the direction of arrival. Even the pale skin and dark beard matched the ancient descriptions perfectly. The gifts that Moctezuma sent to greet the strangers were chosen with exquisite care, each one designed to test whether these beings were truly divine. Golden suns larger than war shields, silver moons that seemed to hold the essence of night itself, and feathered regalia so magnificent that it seemed to capture the very breath of the gods. If these were indeed returning deities, such offerings would be recognized and appreciated. If they were merely men, the sight of such wealth might reveal their true nature. But the strangers' reaction to these gifts was unlike anything the ambassadors had expected. Rather than receiving the treasures with divine dignity, they fell upon them with an eagerness that seemed almost bestial. They bit the gold to test its purity, weighed the silver in their hands like merchants in a marketplace, and showed little interest in the featherwork that had taken master craftsmen years to complete. Their leader spoke of a disease of the heart that could only be cured by gold, words that made no sense to people who valued jade and feathers far above the soft yellow metal. The reports from the coast grew more disturbing as the strangers began their march inland. They moved with a purpose that suggested intimate knowledge of the land, following ancient trade routes with the confidence of men who had walked these paths before. Everywhere they went, they spoke of a single god more powerful than all others, a deity who demanded the destruction of every sacred image, the silencing of every prayer that was not offered to him alone. Most troubling of all, they seemed to possess an uncanny ability to exploit the divisions within the empire. The Tlaxcalans, who had resisted Mexico expansion for generations, welcomed the strangers as allies against their ancient enemies. Other subject peoples, tired of paying tribute to Tenochtitlan, saw opportunity in the arrival of these powerful foreigners. The empire that had seemed unshakable began to reveal the cracks that had always existed beneath its magnificent surface. The psychological warfare was as devastating as any physical attack. The strangers carried with them stories of other empires that had fallen before their advance. The great cities of the Caribbean islands, where golden palaces had been reduced to rubble, where entire peoples had vanished like morning mist before the sun. They spoke of their god's inevitable victory, of the futility of resistance against divine will, of the mercy that would be shown to those who submitted without struggle. The omens that had plagued Tenochtitlan for years took on new meaning as the strangers drew closer to the capital. The comet that had burned in the night sky, the temple that had burst into flames, the woman who walked the streets weeping for her children, all of these now seemed like harbingers of the pale god's arrival. The priests worked frantically to interpret the signs, but their traditional methods of divination seemed inadequate to comprehend the cosmic catastrophe that was approaching. The weapons of the strangers were unlike anything the Mexica had ever encountered. Their swords were made of metal so hard it could cut through obsidian blades like flower stems. Their crossbows could kill at distances that seemed impossible, and their firearms created thunder and lightning that left enemies dead without any visible wound. Most terrifying of all were the horses, creatures from nightmare that seemed to be part animal and part demon, carrying armored riders who struck like lightning and vanished like wind. The diseases that traveled with the strangers were perhaps their most devastating weapon of all, though neither side understood their true nature at the time. Smallpox, typhus, and other old-world illnesses spread through populations that had no immunity, killing not just individuals, but entire families, entire communities. The streets of coastal cities began to fill with the smell of death, while the survivors stumbled through their daily routines like people walking in a waking dream. The theological crisis was perhaps the most profound of all. The arrival of beings who matched the ancient prophecies perfectly, yet behaved in ways that seemed to contradict every understanding of divine nature, created a spiritual paralysis that affected every level of society. If these were gods, why did they destroy the temples where they should have been worshipped? If they were men, how could they possess such impossible powers? As the strangers continued their march toward the heart of the empire, they left behind them a trail of transformation that would never be reversed. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Sacred images that had been venerated for generations were smashed to fragments, and ways of life that had seemed eternal were swept away like leaves before a hurricane. The young warriors of Tenochtitlan prepared for battle with an enthusiasm that masked their growing uncertainty. They painted their faces with the traditional colors of war, sharpened their obsidian blades with prayers to Huitzilopochtli, and performed the rituals that had always brought victory. But privately, many wondered whether their weapons would be effective against beings who might be divine, whether their tactics would work against enemies who seemed to know no fear. The children of the city watched the preparations with eyes wide with excitement and terror. They had grown up hearing stories of the great victories that had built the empire, tales of warriors who had brought glory to Tenochtitlan and tribute from distant lands. But now they sensed that something different was approaching, something that would transform their world in ways they could not even imagine. As night fell over the empire for what might be the last time, the priests climbed to the tops of their pyramids to offer prayers to gods who seemed suddenly distant and uncertain. The smoke from their incense rose into a sky that seemed darker than usual, while the fires of the approaching strangers twinkled in the distance like fallen stars that had come to earth to judge the world. The lake that had been the foundation of their civilization reflected these distant fires like a dark mirror, and in those reflections the people of Tenochtitlan could see their own uncertain future approaching across the water. The pale gods were coming, bringing with them either salvation or destruction, transformation or annihilation. Soon they would know which. November 8th, 1519. The morning sun painted the great causeway of Tenochtitlan in shades of gold and shadow as two worlds prepared to meet for the first time. Picture the scene. Along the broad stone roadway that connected the island city to the mainland, a procession unlike any in human history was unfolding. From the east came the strangers with their impossible beasts and thunder weapons, while from the west emerged the full magnificence of the Aztec Empire in all its terrifying beauty. The causeway itself was a marvel that left the Spanish conquistadors speechless with wonder. Broad enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast, it stretched across the lake like a stone bridge between earth and heaven. The surfaces were polished smooth as mirrors, inlaid with patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. On either side, the chinampas stretched toward the horizon, floating gardens so perfectly arranged they looked like a vast checkerboard, painted in every shade of green imaginable. Moctezuma's procession moved with the stately rhythm of a religious ceremony. The emperor traveled in a litter covered with gold and precious feathers, carried by nobles whose bare feet had been declared too sacred to touch the same ground as common mortals. Before him walked priests, swinging censers that filled the air with clouds of copal incense, the sweet smoke creating veils of mystery that seemed to transform the approaching figures into beings from legend. The emperor himself was dressed in regalia that seemed to capture the very essence of divine power. His tilmatli, the royal cloak, was woven from the finest cotton and decorated with patterns that told the story of creation itself. Each thread had been dyed with pigments so rare that their colors seemed to glow within a light. His headdress was a masterpiece of featherwork that rose above his head like a fountain of emerald and gold, each plume selected from birds that lived in the clouds and sang with the voices of angels. Behind Moctezuma came the flower of Mexica nobility, warriors whose bodies were painted in patterns that seemed to move with their breathing, priests whose obsidian ornaments caught the light like captured stars, and scribes who carried the sacred books that contained the wisdom of the ages. The sound of their movement was like music, the rustle of feathers, the soft chiming of gold and jade ornaments, the whispered prayers that rose from their lips like incense made of words. But it was the sight of Tenochtitlan itself that truly overwhelmed the European visitors. As they approached the city across the causeway, they saw before them something that seemed too magnificent to be real, a metropolis that appeared to float on the water like a vision from the most fantastic dreams. The pyramids rose toward the sky like mountains built by gods, their steps gleaming white in the morning sun, their summits crowned with temples that seemed to touch the clouds themselves. The canals that crisscrossed the city were filled with boats that moved like a water ballet choreographed by divine hands. Thousands of canoes carried goods and passengers between the different districts, their occupants calling to each other in voices that seemed to echo off the water and the stone buildings that lined the waterways. The bridges that spanned these canals were works of art in themselves, carved with symbols that told stories of conquest and creation, decorated with flowers that seemed to bloom eternally. The houses of the nobles were palaces that would have impressed the kings of Europe. Multi-story buildings arranged around courtyards filled with gardens that bloomed in impossible profusion. The walls were covered with murals that seemed to move in the shifting light, depicting scenes from mythology and history with a vividness that made the painted figures seem alive. The rooftops were crowned with gardens that seemed to float in the air, their flowers and trees creating a canopy of green that softened the city's stone edges. Cortés himself was magnificent in his way, tall and stern, wrapped in armor that had been polished until it gleamed like liquid silver. His horse, the first such creature most of the Mexica had ever seen, stepped delicately across the stone causeway, as if aware that it was making history with each hoofbeat. The conquistador's face was set in lines of determination and wonder, for even he, seasoned veteran of many campaigns, had never seen anything like the city that lay before him. The meeting itself took place at the great plaza of Tlatelolco, where the causeway widened into a space large enough to hold the entire populations of most European cities. The plaza was surrounded by pyramid temples that rose like stepped mountains toward the sky, their surfaces covered with carvings that seemed to writhe in the morning light. The sound of 10,000 people breathing created a whisper that seemed to make the very air tremble with anticipation. When Moctezuma descended from his litter, the silence that fell over the assembled multitude was so complete it seemed as if the world itself had stopped breathing. The emperor moved with a dignity that spoke of generations of divine authority, his every gesture choreographed by centuries of ritual and tradition. When he spoke, his voice carried across the plaza without effort, each word seeming to hang in the air like a prayer made audible. The gifts that were exchanged in that moment were more than mere objects. They were symbols of world views so different that they might have come from different planets. Moctezuma presented Cortés with a feathered headdress that represented years of work by master craftsmen, a collar of gold and jade that spoke of the empire's wealth, and weapons of obsidian that were sharper than any steel. Each gift was offered with ceremonies that acknowledged the recipient's divine nature, for the emperor still believed he was entertaining returning gods. Cortés responded with objects that must have seemed equally mystical to Mexican eyes: glass beads that captured light like solidified water, iron tools that held edges that never dulled, and cloth woven with patterns that seemed impossibly complex. But his most significant gift was intangible, words that spoke of a single God who ruled over all others, of a king across the water who claimed dominion over all lands, of a faith that demanded the abandonment of everything the Mexica held sacred. The translation of this first conversation was handled by Malinche, the indigenous woman who had learned Spanish during her captivity and now served as the bridge between worlds. Her voice carried the weight of history as she transformed the thoughts of one civilization into the language of another, knowing that every word she spoke was reshaping the future of the Americas. The burden of being the interpreter between gods and men must have seemed almost unbearable. The tour of Tenochtitlan that followed was a journey through wonders that defied European imagination. Cortés and his men were led through the great market of Tlatelolco, where the wealth of two continents was displayed in organized abundance that rivaled anything in Europe. They saw fruits that seemed to glow within a light, flowers that released fragrances sweeter than any perfume, and birds whose songs seemed to capture the very essence of paradise. The Spanish soldiers moved through this wonderland with eyes wide with amazement and greed. They saw gold used as casually as Europeans used iron, jade carved with a precision that surpassed anything in their homeland, and featherwork so fine it seemed painted with brushes made of air and light. Their leader maintained his diplomatic composure, but his men whispered among themselves in voices thick with avarice and wonder. The visit to the great temple was perhaps the most profound moment of all. As they climbed the steep steps of the main pyramid, both groups were acutely aware that they were ascending not just a physical structure, but a spiritual mountain that connected earth to heaven. At the summit, the Spanish saw the massive stone images of Mexica gods, Huitzilopochtli with his fierce visage and Tlaloc with his goggled eyes, surrounded by the implements of sacrifice that kept the universe in balance. The reaction of the conquistadors to these sacred images was one of horror and fascination. They saw not gods but demons, not sacred art, but idolatry that must be destroyed. The priests who tended these shrines were viewed not as holy men, but as servants of darkness who led their people into damnation. The theological gulf between the two civilizations revealed itself in that moment as an abyss that might never be bridged. But for the Mexica, the presence of these pale strangers in their most sacred space was confirmation that the ancient prophecies were being fulfilled. Here were beings who had arrived from the East, who possessed impossible powers, who spoke of cosmic matters with the authority of divinity. If these were indeed the returning gods, then the empire itself was merely the stage on which a cosmic drama was being performed. The accommodations provided for the Spanish were magnificent beyond their dreams, an entire palace complex that had been prepared as if for visiting deities. The rooms were filled with furniture made of precious woods, decorated with tapestries that told the stories of the empire, and supplied with food and drink that seemed to come from paradise itself. The servants who attended them moved with the reverence due to divine beings, their every gesture speaking of awe and fear. But underneath the magnificent hospitality, currents of tension were already beginning to flow. The Spanish demands for gold became more insistent with each passing day, their questions about the empire's wealth more pointed and aggressive. The Mexica began to sense that these beings, whatever their divine nature, possessed appetites that might prove impossible to satisfy. The children of Tenochtitlan watched the strangers with a mixture of fascination and fear. These pale men with their hairy faces and metal clothing seemed like creatures from the underworld, yet they walked among the living with apparent ease. The horses were even more disturbing, beasts that seemed to combine the power of jaguars with the intelligence of men, creating sounds that echoed through the stone streets like the voices of monsters. As night fell over the city on that first day of the meeting between worlds, both groups retired to their quarters, with minds spinning with wonder and calculation. The Spanish wrote letters to their king describing wonders that seemed too fantastic to be believed, while the Mexica sent messengers to distant provinces with news that the ancient prophecies were being fulfilled. The lake reflected the lights of both civilizations, the torches of Tenochtitlan and the oil lamps of the Spanish quarters, creating a double image that seemed to symbolize the collision of worlds that was now inevitable. Two great streams of human development, separated by oceans and millennia, had finally met in the middle of a lake that would soon run red with the blood of empires. The night of June 30th, 1520, descended upon Tenochtitlan like a curtain of black water, heavy with the weight of betrayal and the promise of blood. In the palace where Moctezuma had welcomed the strangers as returning gods, the Spanish now huddled like trapped animals, their armor tarnished with the smoke of burned temples, their weapons sharp with the blood of priests whose only crime had been serving their gods. Picture the city in those dark hours before the storm. The canals that had once carried the gentle commerce of empire now reflected the red glow of burning buildings. The bridges that had welcomed tribute bearers from distant lands were now barricaded with stones and timber, transformed from pathways of peace into fortifications of war. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of accumulated rage, years of humiliation and submission finally crystallizing into a fury that would shake the foundations of the world. The breaking point had come with the massacre at the temple of Huitzilopochtli, where Alvarado and his men had turned a sacred ceremony into a slaughter that defied every understanding of honor and divinity. The festival of Toxcatl should have been a celebration of the gods' power, a ritual dance that connected earth to heaven through the movement of bodies painted with the colors of creation. Instead, it had become a blood-soaked horror that revealed the true nature of the pale strangers. The warriors who survived that massacre carried word through the city with voices cracked by grief and fury. They spoke of priests cut down while offering prayers, of dancers slaughtered while performing steps that had been handed down through generations, of sacred objects trampled underfoot by men who showed no more reverence than wild beasts. The news spread through Tenochtitlan like fire through dry reeds, igniting a rage that had been smoldering beneath the surface of submission for months. Moctezuma himself had become a tragic figure caught between worlds that would no longer allow him to exist. The emperor, who had once ruled the mightiest empire in the Americas, now found himself a prisoner in his own palace, his words carrying weight only when they served the purposes of his captors. When he appeared before his people to ask for peace, the stones they threw at him seemed to carry the weight of their broken hearts, their shattered faith in the cosmic order that had sustained them. The death of Moctezuma, whether from the stones of his own people or the secret violence of his captors, marked the end of an age that had lasted for centuries. The man who had been the living voice of the gods on earth died in circumstances that stripped away every shred of the dignity that had defined his life. His body, when it was returned to his people, seemed smaller somehow, as if the departure of his spirit had taken with it something essential that could never be recovered. But the death of the emperor only intensified the fury that was building in the hearts of his people. The new leaders who emerged, Quitlawak, who had never trusted the strangers, and the young warriors who had grown to manhood watching their world be destroyed, understood that this was no longer a conflict between mortals and gods. This was a war for the very survival of everything they held sacred. The Spanish, trapped in their palace complex like an island surrounded by a sea of rage, prepared for what they knew would be a desperate flight to safety. Cortés, the man who had conquered an empire through cunning and audacity, now found himself facing the consequences of his lieutenant's brutality. The treasure that had been accumulated, gold melted down from sacred objects, silver torn from temple walls, jewels pried from the images of gods, had become a burden that might cost them their lives. The plan was simple in conception, but terrifying in execution. Escape under cover of darkness, carrying as much treasure as possible, fighting their way across the causeway to the mainland where their allies waited. It was a gamble that required them to move unseen through a city whose every inhabitant had become their enemy, across bridges that could be destroyed at any moment, through water that could become their grave. The night chosen for the escape was moonless and dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to press against the skin like a living thing. The Spanish moved through the palace corridors with movements muffled by cloth wrapped around their armor, their breathing carefully controlled despite the terror that made their hearts race like drums beaten by frightened children. Each step seemed to echo despite their precautions, each sound a potential death sentence in a city that had become a labyrinth of enemies. The treasure was distributed among the soldiers according to a cruel mathematics. Those who carried the most gold moved the slowest, while those who traveled light had the best chance of survival. Many of the conquistadors, their greed overwhelming their judgment, loaded themselves with wealth that would drag them to the bottom of the lake if they fell into the water. The irony was bitter. The gold they had killed for was now likely to kill them. The first part of the escape went better than anyone had dared hope. The guards at the palace gates had been silenced quietly, their bodies hidden in shadows that seemed to swallow evidence of the Spanish presence. The streets immediately around the palace were empty, their normal population of merchants and artisans replaced by a silence that felt almost supernatural in its completeness. But as they approached the first bridge on the causeway, the nightmare began in earnest. The sound of their movement, the clink of armor, the breathing of horses, the soft curses of men stumbling under the weight of stolen treasure, finally reached ears that had been waiting for exactly such sounds. The war cry that rose from the darkness was like the voice of the earth itself expressing its rage at the violation of its sacred places. Suddenly, the lake around the causeway erupted with canoes filled with warriors whose bodies had been painted with the colors of death and vengeance. They emerged from the darkness like spirits of the drowned, their paddles cutting through water that seemed to glow with phosphorescent anger. The sound of their war cries mixed with the splash of paddles and the whistle of arrows to create a symphony of violence that would haunt the survivors' dreams for the rest of their lives. The bridges that had been marvels of engineering now became death traps. The Mexica had removed the wooden sections that allowed passage, leaving gaps that could only be crossed by those willing to leap into darkness with no guarantee of landing safely on the other side. The Spanish horses, panic-stricken by the noise and chaos, threw their riders into the lake where the weight of armor and gold dragged many to the bottom before they could even cry out for help. The fighting on the causeway was unlike anything in the long history of warfare. Spanish steel met Mexican obsidian in a clash that created sparks visible even in the darkness. The conquistadors fought with the desperation of men who knew that capture meant not just death, but sacrifice in ceremonies that would turn their suffering into divine nourishment. The Mexica warriors fought with a fury that seemed to transcend human emotion, their movements guided by rage that had been purified into something approaching religious ecstasy. The water around the causeway turned red with blood that seemed black in the darkness. Bodies of men and horses floated like islands of tragedy in a lake that had once reflected the beauty of the greatest city in the Americas. The treasure that had been looted from temples sank to the bottom, gold and silver creating an underwater cemetery that would preserve the memory of this night in the mud of Lake Texcoco. Cortés himself fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting through enemies, while his mind calculated the mathematical impossibility of survival. Around him his men fell one by one, some to Mexica weapons, others to the lake itself as they stumbled from the causeway and disappeared beneath water that closed over them like a dark mouth. The leader who had conquered an empire through words and strategy now found himself reduced to the most primitive form of human activity, fighting for his life in the darkness. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. The Spanish who survived the causeway crossing were those who abandoned their treasure and ran with the speed of men whose lives depended on their feet. Behind them, the city of Tenochtitlan blazed with torches as the entire population turned out to witness the expulsion of the pale demons who had brought such suffering to their world. When dawn finally broke over Lake Texcoco, the survivors of the Spanish force found themselves on the mainland, reduced to a fraction of their original number, their armor dented and blood-stained, their dreams of easy conquest transformed into memories of terror and flight. The treasure that had seemed so important just hours before was now lying at the bottom of the lake, an offering to Tlaloc that had been paid in Spanish blood and Mexica vengeance. But the night of sorrows, La Noche Triste, as the Spanish would call it, was not the end of the story. It was merely the pause between the movements of a symphony that would culminate in the destruction of Tenochtitlan itself. For even as the Mexica celebrated their victory, the diseases that had come with the strangers were already spreading through the population like invisible fire, weakening the empire from within just as surely as Spanish steel had threatened it from without. The lake that had witnessed this night of violence reflected the morning sun like a mirror stained with blood, and in its depths lay treasures that would never again see the light of day. The night of sorrows had ended, but the sorrow itself would continue, growing and spreading until it consumed everything that the Mexica had built over the centuries of their rise to power. 13 months after the night of sorrows, the dawn of May 26, 1521, broke over a Lake Texcoco that no longer reflected the glory of empire. The water that had once carried the commerce of 2 continents now lapped against the hulls of Spanish brigantines, impossible ships that moved without paddles, their sails filled with winds that seemed to blow from the realm of death itself. Around the floating city of Tenochtitlan, the circle of iron and wood was closing like a noose made of nightmares and inevitability. Picture the scene as it must have appeared to the last defenders of the Aztec Empire. The city that had once been the wonder of the world now stood like a magnificent ruin, its pyramids still reaching toward the sky, but their temples empty of all but the most desperate prayers. The Chinampas that had fed hundreds of thousands were withered and brown, their intricate canal systems disrupted by the siege works that surrounded the city like the coils of some vast serpent. The causeway that had once carried tribute bearers from distant provinces now bristled with Spanish fortifications and indigenous allies who had chosen to side with the conquistadors. The sight of Tlaxcalans and other traditional enemies fighting alongside the pale strangers must have seemed like a reversal of the cosmic order itself, as if the very stars had decided to abandon their proper courses and dance in chaos across the night sky. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor who had inherited an empire in its death throes, moved through his besieged city with the dignity of a man who understood that he was performing the last act of a drama that had begun in the mists of legend. At barely 25 years old, he carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders, the burden of being the final voice of gods who seemed to have turned their faces away from the city they had once loved. The emperor's name meant falling eagle, and there could have been no more fitting title for the man who would preside over the end of Mexica power. He had none of Moctezuma's uncertainty about the nature of the strangers. To Cuauhtémoc, they were simply enemies who must be fought with every weapon available, every strategy conceivable, every ounce of strength that remained in the bodies of his people. The siege itself was unlike anything the Americas had ever witnessed. Cortés, having learned bitter lessons during his first attempt to conquer the city, now approached Tenochtitlan with the methodical patience of a man who understood that time itself had become his most powerful weapon. The brigantines that controlled the lake cut off not just supplies but hope itself, their presence a daily reminder that the empire's dominion over water, the foundation of its power, had passed into foreign hands. The diseases that had arrived with the Europeans proved to be more devastating than any army. Smallpox moved through the population like an invisible fire, consuming entire neighborhoods, leaving behind empty houses where families had lived for generations. The smell of death hung over the city like incense offered to gods who no longer listened, while the survivors stumbled through streets that had become vast cemeteries under the open sky. Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had briefly succeeded Moctezuma, had been among the first victims of the plague, his death robbing the resistance of a leader who had never compromised with the invaders. His passing seemed to symbolize the helplessness of human authority in the face of forces that operated beyond the reach of political or military solutions. Even the gods themselves seemed vulnerable to these invisible enemies that killed without regard for rank or righteousness. The food situation grew desperate as the siege continued through the summer months. The Chinampas that had made Tenochtitlan independent of the mainland were now cut off from the city by Spanish naval patrols. The stores of grain that had been accumulated for times of scarcity dwindled day by day, forcing people to subsist on anything that could provide nourishment: tree bark, grass, leather from shields and clothing, even the mortar between stones. The warriors who defended the city fought with a desperation that transcended human endurance. They had seen their temples desecrated, their priests murdered, their emperor humiliated, and their people decimated by disease. What remained was not hope for victory, but the simple determination to make their enemies pay the highest possible price for each street, each building, each stone of the city they had built with such love and labor. The Spanish assault on the city proceeded block by block, building by building, with a methodical destruction that seemed designed to erase not just Mexica power, but Mexica memory itself. Each captured pyramid was torn down stone by stone, its sacred carvings defaced or destroyed, its very existence erased from the landscape. The conquistadors understood that they were not just conquering territory, they were obliterating a worldview that threatened their own understanding of reality. The bridges that had connected the different districts of the city became focal points for battles that raged for days at a time. Each span of stone and timber was defended with a ferocity that amazed even the Spanish veterans who had seen warfare in Europe and the Caribbean. The Mexica warriors fought as if each bridge contained the essence of their civilization, as if allowing the enemy to pass meant the death of everything their ancestors had built. The canals themselves became battlegrounds where canoes filled with warriors clashed in conflicts that turned the water red with blood. The Spanish brigantines with their cannon and crossbows dominated these naval battles, but the Mexica fought back with a creativity born of desperation. They drove stakes into the lake bottom to trap enemy vessels, used fire arrows to try to set sails ablaze, and sent swimmers to attack the ships from below in suicide missions that spoke of courage refined into something approaching madness. The sound of destruction became the constant background music of the siege. The crash of falling masonry mixed with the screams of the wounded and dying, while the smoke from burning buildings created a pall that turned day into twilight and made the stars invisible at night. The city that had once pulsed with the rhythm of commerce and ceremony now beat with the irregular heartbeat of a civilization in its death throes. The children of Tenochtitlan, those who survived the diseases and the fighting, learned to play games that reflected their transformed world. They built tiny fortifications from rubble and acted out battles between warriors and pale strangers, their innocent voices unconsciously preserving the memory of destruction for future generations. Their laughter, when it came at all, had a hollow quality that spoke of childhoods lost to circumstances beyond their understanding. The priests who remained alive continued to perform ceremonies in temples that had been reduced to ruins, their voices rising in prayers that seemed to echo strangely in the emptiness. They burned what little copal they could find, offered flowers that grew wild in the rubble, and maintained rituals that kept alive the connection between earth and heaven, even as the world around them crumbled into chaos. The final assault came in August, as the summer rains that had once been welcomed as gifts from Tlaloc now seemed like tears falling from a sky that wept for the dying city. Cuauhtémoc and his remaining warriors made their last stand in the ruins of the great temple complex, fighting among the broken stones of pyramids that had once reached toward the realm of the gods. The young emperor was captured while attempting to flee in a canoe across the lake, his dignity intact, even as his empire collapsed around him. The Spanish accounts describe a man who faced his captors with a composure that impressed even his enemies, understanding that he had become not just a prisoner, but a symbol of resistance that would outlive his own mortality. The treasure that Cortés demanded from the fallen emperor had already been thrown into the lake by the defenders, who preferred to see their sacred objects returned to Tlaloc rather than melted down by the conquerors. The gold and silver that sank beneath the dark water became offerings to gods who had not been able to save their people, but who might, perhaps, preserve their memory in the depths of the lake that had been their home. When the last stone had fallen, and the last defender had been subdued, Tenochtitlan lay in ruins that spoke eloquently of the magnitude of what had been lost. The city that had been home to perhaps 200,000 people was reduced to empty shells and rubble-filled canals, while the lake around it reflected not the glory of empire, but the smoke of funeral pyres that burned for days. The survivors wandered through the destruction like ghosts, searching for a world that no longer existed. They picked through the rubble looking for anything that might have survived. A pottery fragment painted with familiar designs, a piece of jewelry that had belonged to a lost family member, a book whose pages might preserve some fragment of the knowledge that had been their inheritance. The Spanish began almost immediately to build their own city on the ruins of the old, using stones from Mexica temples to construct churches dedicated to their god. The irony was bitter. The pyramids that had been raised to honor Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc were being transformed into the foundations for buildings that would proclaim the victory of alien deities over the gods who had created the world. As night fell over the conquered city for the first time in centuries, without the sound of conch shells marking the hours of divine time, the lake lapped against shores that were no longer lined with palaces and gardens, but with the debris of a civilization that had vanished as completely as if it had been a dream, from which the world had suddenly awakened. The silence that settled over Lake Texcoco was profound and absolute, broken only by the gentle movement of water that would, in time, cover the ruins with silt and sediment until future generations would find it difficult to believe that such magnificence had ever existed in this place. The empire that had stretched from sea to sea, that had built cities that rivaled the greatest achievements of the ancient world, that had created art and architecture of breathtaking beauty and sophistication, was gone. 500 years have passed since the last emperor of Tenochtitlan spoke his final words, since the last pyramid stone fell into waters that would never again reflect the glory of floating gardens and feathered warriors. The lake itself is gone now, drained and filled to make room for a modern city that sprawls across what was once the heart of an empire. But on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right across the ancient valley, you can still hear them. The echoes of conch shells marking the hours of divine time, the splash of ceremonial canoes cutting through water that exists now only in memory. Picture the Mexico City of today, built layer upon layer over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Beneath the streets and buildings, beneath the subway tunnels and shopping centers, lie the stones that once formed the foundations of the greatest city in the Americas. Sometimes, when construction crews dig deep enough, they uncover fragments of that lost world, a carved serpent's head that once adorned a temple wall, a jade ornament that fell from a priest's regalia, pottery shards painted with colors that still seem to glow after centuries in the darkness. The Templo Mayor, the great pyramid that stood at the heart of the Aztec capital, has been partially excavated and transformed into a museum where visitors can walk among the ruins and try to imagine the magnificence that once soared toward the sky. The stones speak in whispers of ceremonies that shook the earth, of emperors' coronations and prisoners' sacrifices, of prayers offered to gods whose names are still remembered even though their temples have crumbled into dust. But the true legacy of the Aztec Empire lives not in museums or archaeological sites, but in the blood and memory of the millions of people who still call this valley home. The faces you see in the markets of Mexico City, the languages you hear spoken in mountain villages, the foods sold by street vendors, whose recipes have been passed down through generations, all of these carry within them the genetic and cultural inheritance of the people who built Tenochtitlan from dreams and determination. The children who today play in the parks where pyramid steps once climbed toward heaven carry in their DNA the memory of warriors who painted their faces with the colors of divine wrath, of farmers who coaxed impossible abundance from floating gardens, of priests who read the future in the flight of eagles. They are the living continuation of a story that seemed to end with the fall of the empire, but which has actually never stopped unfolding. The chocolate that the world now takes for granted was first transformed from bitter cacao beans into liquid gold by Mexica hands in kitchens that looked out over the lake of dreams. The tomatoes and corn that feed billions were first cultivated in chinampas that bobbed gently on waters that reflected the movements of the stars. The very concept of cities built in harmony with nature, of urban planning that considered both human needs and cosmic order, originated in the minds of engineers who understood that civilization must be a collaboration between human will and divine intention. The Spanish conquistadors believed they had destroyed the Aztec Empire completely, erasing its religion, its language, its way of understanding the world. But empires, like dreams, have a way of surviving in forms that their destroyers never anticipated. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared to the indigenous man Juan Diego just 10 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, bore a striking resemblance to the Aztec goddess Tonantzin, suggesting that the old gods had simply learned to wear new faces while continuing to watch over their people. The Day of the Dead celebrations that transform Mexico each November blend indigenous traditions of honoring ancestors with Catholic rituals in ways that create something entirely new yet deeply familiar. The marigold flowers that carpet graveyards and altars are the same flowers that once decorated the chinampas of Tenochtitlan, their orange petals still creating bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The artistic traditions that began in the workshops of Mexica, craftsmen continue to flourish in forms that would amaze the original creators. The murals of Diego Rivera and José Clemente Orozco drew inspiration from codex paintings that told the stories of creation and conquest in pigments made from precious minerals. The monumental sculptures of Henry Moore and other modern artists echo the massive stone carvings that once adorned Aztec temples, their forms speaking a visual language that transcends cultural boundaries. Even the Spanish language, as it is spoken in Mexico, carries within it hundreds of words borrowed from Nahuatl, the tongue of the Aztec Empire. When modern Mexicans speak of chocolate or tomatoes, coyotes or avocados, they are using words that were first spoken in the palaces of Tenochtitlan, linguistic treasures that survived the conquest to become part of the global vocabulary. The archaeological work that continues to this day keeps revealing new aspects of the empire that was lost. Ground-penetrating radar has detected the remains of structures still buried beneath Mexico City, while chemical analysis of lake-bottom sediments tells the story of environmental changes that accompanied the rise and fall of Mexican power. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding how complex and sophisticated this civilization truly was. The legend of Quetzalcoatl's return, which may have contributed to Moctezuma's initial welcome of Cortés, has taken on new meaning in an age of global communication and cultural exchange. Some see in the internet and social media a fulfillment of ancient prophecies about the return of the feathered serpent, bringing knowledge and connection across vast distances, just as the god was said to have done in the mythical past. The environmental crisis that faces the modern world has given new relevance to Aztec understanding of the relationship between human civilization and natural systems. The chinampas of Tenochtitlan were among the most sustainable agricultural systems ever developed, producing abundant food, while actually improving the ecological health of the lake that supported them. Scientists studying climate change and sustainable development often look to these ancient techniques for insights that might help solve contemporary problems. The spiritual traditions that the Spanish tried so hard to erase have found new expression in movements that blend indigenous wisdom with modern understanding. Sweat lodges and medicine ceremonies, vision quests and shamanic healing, these practices, while not specifically Aztec, draw from the same well of indigenous knowledge that sustained the empire for centuries. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Aztec Empire is the simple fact that it existed at all. In an age when European thinkers believed they represented the pinnacle of human achievement, the discovery of Tenochtitlan forced them to confront the reality that other civilizations had reached levels of sophistication that rivaled or exceeded their own. The very existence of the Aztec Empire expanded the human understanding of what was possible, what could be achieved when vision was combined with determination and divine inspiration. The dreams that built Tenochtitlan, the vision of a city that would be the center of the world, of an empire that would stretch from sea to sea, of a civilization that would bridge earth and heaven, These dreams live on in every human heart that refuses to accept the limitations of the present, that insists on reaching for something greater than what currently exists. When you walk through the ruins of the Templo Mayor, when you taste chocolate in a small cafe, when you see marigolds blooming in a cemetery, when you hear Nahuatl words in Spanish sentences, you are experiencing the continuing presence of an empire that never truly fell, because it had already planted its seeds too deeply in the soil of human consciousness to be uprooted by conquest. The lake is gone, the pyramids are ruined, the emperors are dust. But the dream that made them possible, the vision of human beings working in harmony with cosmic forces to create something beautiful and lasting, that dream continues to ripple outward through time like circles on the surface of water, touching shores that the original dreamers never imagined but somehow always knew would one day exist. As the sun sets over the modern city that covers the bones of Tenochtitlan, as the evening star rises in the same sky that guided Mexica astronomers, as children play games whose rules contain echoes of ancient rituals, the empire lives on. Not as a political entity or a military power, but as a reminder that human beings, when they align themselves with forces larger than their individual desires, can create wonders that outlast the civilizations that built them. The Aztec Empire was never just about conquest or tribute or the building of monuments. It was about the audacious belief that mortals could create a city worthy of the gods, that human hands could build bridges between earth and heaven, that dreams, when pursued with sufficient faith and determination, could reshape the world itself. That belief, that dream, that vision of human possibility, these are the true treasures of the empire, the gold that cannot be melted down, the jade that cannot be broken, the feathers that cannot be burned. They live on in every heart that refuses to accept the world as it is and insists on working to make it what it could be. The empire of the Aztecs is gone, but the empire of human dreams continues, as eternal as the stars that guided their astronomers, as enduring as the love that built their floating gardens, as powerful as the faith that transformed wandering nomads into the builders of the greatest city the Americas had ever seen. And so we come to the end of our journey through the mists of time, back from the floating city of Tenochtitlan to this quiet moment where you rest, your mind filled with images of pyramids rising from water, of warriors painted with the colors of divinity, of an empire that transformed dreams into stone and gold and memory. The Aztec Empire teaches us that the most extraordinary achievements begin with ordinary people who refuse to accept ordinary limitations. The Mexica started as wanderers carrying nothing but faith and ended as builders of the greatest city in the Americas. Their story reminds us that within every human heart lies the capacity to create wonders, to transform the world, to leave behind something that will outlast our individual lives. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the vision of those floating gardens blooming eternally in memory, of those pyramid steps climbing towards stars that still shine with the same light that guided Aztec astronomers. Let your dreams be filled with the sound of conch shells marking the hours of divine time, with the splash of ceremonial canoes moving through waters that reflect not just the sky, but the infinite possibilities that exist within the human spirit. Rest now and dream of empires built from vision and determination, of cities that float between earth and heaven, of the eternal human quest to create something beautiful and lasting in a world that often seems dedicated to destruction and forgetting. The story of the Aztecs is over, but the story of human dreaming continues with every breath you take, every vision you pursue, every moment you choose to believe that something greater is possible. Sleep well and dream of pyramids.